Today we're reviewing the Alienware AW3926QW, one of the most exciting and eagerly awaited displays that was unveiled at Computex in June. It's been released in some Asian markets already, about a month or so ago now, and it should finally be appearing in North America and Europe imminently for you to buy. So this is a 39-inch ultrawide OLED monitor with a 1500R curvature and a latest gen Tandem WOLED panel from LG Display. This offers a 5120 by 2160 or so-called 5K 2K resolution, a 165Hz refresh rate, and a dual mode function which can boost you up to 330Hz at an ultra-wide 1080p resolution for faster gaming situations. Now this spec may sound familiar. It's the same that we saw on LG's UltraGear 39GX950B, which we reviewed back in April, and it's only the second OLED monitor to come to market offering this killer combination of size and resolution, which we really like. But there's two fundamental differences here with the panel used for the Alienware model, and then of course some differing features and connectivity options as well. From a panel point of view, firstly, it's got a glossy finish, so fans of glossy coatings will no doubt love the change here compared with LG's matte finish. It offers a super sharp and clear image and looks cleaner and more immersive than anti-glare coatings. But on the other hand, you do need to be more mindful of glare and reflections with this kind of coating. It's the same coating that we've seen on other glossy WOLED monitors in the past, such as ASUS's True Black Glossy and Gigabyte's Real Black Glossy finishes, so there's no change from that point of view. External light is not diffused across the screen like it is on a matte anti-glare coating, so in some situations the black depth and contrast are retained better, and you only have to worry then about more isolated light reflections. These are, however, more mirror-like reflections, and so they can be more problematic in darker content especially, and they can be distracting for many users. The curvature of the screen also changes the behaviour of the reflections a little bit compared with the flat glossy WOLED monitors that we've tested in the past. The curve will distort and stretch reflections horizontally, which can look a bit strange, so you do need to be mindful of your ambient light conditions and the locations of any light sources, particularly if they're facing the screen behind where you're sitting. In some situations you do get fewer direct reflections though, as the reflection field of view is narrower because of the curve of the screen, so there's a bit of a balancing act there in terms of handling reflections. While we're talking about the curve, this is a much more subtle curve than previous 39-inch ultra-wide OLED monitors that were released in the past before these 5K 2K resolution models came along, dropping from a very steep 800R curvature to a more subtle 1500R curvature here. We think this is a nice balance on a screen this size and provides a comfortable and very usable format. Whether a glossy or a matte coating is better for you depends on your individual preferences and your usage environment, but we think glossy is better for a cleaner and more impressive image in more dimly lit rooms and where you don't have to worry about external light sources and windows facing the screen. If you're using the screen in a more well-lit environment, or if you've got light sources in front of the screen, or you find reflections particularly annoying, a matte anti-glare coating would be better for you. At least we've now got a choice here in the 39-inch 5K 2K ultra-wide OLED monitor market, which is great news. The other key panel difference here is a fundamental change from the panel manufacturer LG Display, with Alienware adopting a version of their 39-inch ultra-wide Tandem WOLED panel with an RGB-stripe subpixel layout, which changes the performance in a few areas which we'll explore during this review. This is the only OLED monitor of this size released so far with an RGB stripe panel as well. So if you want to know more about this new type of OLED, all of the known panels and monitors released or announced so far, check out our article link below for loads more information. Traditional WOLED panels have not only red, green and blue subpixels, but also an added white subpixel. And that's been used since WOLED monitor panels were introduced several years ago. It's used primarily to help improve panel brightness, but unfortunately having an extra subpixel does lead to some text rendering challenges, and you can get fringing and artifacts on text in certain situations, especially on lower pixel density panels. The panel used in the LG Electronics equivalent model featured an RGB subpixel layout with the additional white subpixel And we commented at the time that we felt that text clarity was already very good on that panel, thanks to the 143 ppi pixel density, and that the vast majority of users should find this perfectly fine. Alienware's model uses the RGB-stripe version of the panel, which has removed the white subpixel and now offers a layout that Windows OS expects, leading to perfect text rendering now, and the elimination of any remaining visible fringing that you might see. The RGWB panel was already very good, as we say, but side by side you can see an improvement here still, partly assisted also by the cleaner and clearer glossy panel coating. For anyone who's especially sensitive to text rendering issues or fringing, or wanting to use a screen for lots of office and text work alongside gaming and multimedia, then this is a great new option being offered. With the white subpixel being removed, to produce white on the Alienware screen, the 3 subpixels, the RGB subpixels, need to be activated now, whereas on the RGWB panel, the white subpixel did much of the heavy lifting. This leads to a considerably higher power consumption on the RGB stripe panel, shown here for a couple of examples when showing an all-white screen, a reasonable proxy for general office applications. There may potentially be some considerations around lifespan from having to activate all 3 subpixels instead of just the white subpixel on this new RGB stripe panel too, although that does remain to be seen, and LG Display haven't been as open about the lifespan expectations on their RGB stripe panels as on their Tandem WOLED panels in general. We don't expect this to really be an issue though for normal users, and they'll provide a 3-year warranty with burn-in cover included as well. Removing the white subpixel does have some performance drawbacks as well, with the main consideration being brightness. Looking at the panel specs for this Alienware screen and LG's equivalent model, you can see that there's a small impact to the quoted SDR maximum brightness, and the HDR peak brightness spec drops from 1500 nits to 1300 nits, although the screen is still certified under the VESA Display HDR True Black 500 tier, which is great news. Let's see what real-world difference removing the white pixel has on brightness. In SDR, we measured a maximum luminance of 300 nits, which is in line with the spec, and it's around 12% lower than the LG model, which also matches the advertised spec. This is probably irrelevant unless you're using your screen at the maximum brightness in SDR and 300 nits isn't enough for some reason, but we think for most people there's plenty of brightness range here on offer anyway. The screen operates with a uniform brightness behavior in SDR, so you get nice consistent brightness regardless of your content, which is great news. There isn't any option to disable the uniform brightness behavior though, so should you want to try and push brightness even further in SDR gaming and movies, that could have been useful, but it should still be bright enough anyway in the uniform behavior. SDR luminance is pretty close really to the RGWB panel, and 300 nits from an OLED is perceptually equivalent to an LCD of around 510 nits brightness, thanks to the improved contrast from these panels. That's a topic that we've explored in more detail in our article linked below if you want to know more. This 300 nits luminance puts it broadly in line with most of the other modern WOLED and QD-OLED monitors that we've tested recently, although the latest 34-inch QD-OLED model reached a little higher at 327 nits. But both are brighter than the earlier Alienware models like the AW3426QW from 2022, which reached 240 nits. The minimum luminance reached down to 42 nits as well, which should be adequate for most users in darker room conditions. We'll come back to HDR performance in a moment, as that's the other key area which could be impacted by the removal of the white subpixel. But before we do that, let's just look a little bit more at the SDR accuracy. In terms of other SDR performance and accuracy, the screen comes out of the box in the standard preset mode, which operates with the full native gamut of the panel. There's controls in the menu for brightness and contrast, but no access to gamma or colour settings in this mode. Thankfully, we had a nice accurate gamma overall, with a great RGB balance and grayscale temperature as well, being only a tiny amount too cool, which was great news. The panel offers a wide colour gamut, offering 136% relative coverage of the sRGB colour space and 79% of BT 2020. This was basically identical to the other RGB stripe Tandem WOLED panel that we reviewed recently, ASUS's 32-inch ROG Swift PG32UCWM. This is also very similar to the 5th gen QD-OLED panel used in Alienware's recently launched 34-inch ultrawide model for 2026, You can see some other comparisons here against a previous gen WOLED panel which had a slightly smaller colour gamut than this new panel, but the more recent Tandem WOLED panels where the white subpixel is still retained seems to offer a bit of a wider colour gamut than the RGB-stripe version. With the wide colour gamut active, accuracy of sRGB colours is only moderate, but that's normal and expected for any wide gamut screen because of the oversaturation that it causes. We'll look at ways to improve SDR accuracy in a moment. With the panel's colour space more closely matching the DCI-P3 reference space, the accuracy of those colours was very good. Alienware offer two emulation modes in the menu via the Creator preset, one for sRGB and the other for DCI-P3. You have access here to the brightness and contrast controls, as well as a new option for gamma in these modes. But there's no adjustment still for colours or colour temperature or anything like that. According to the factory calibration report, the sRGB mode should be configured to the sRGB gamma curve, close to 2.2, but with some near black adjustments. Actually, we found that it seemed to be configured to 2.2 after all, and this was overall quite close to this target anyway. Grayscale and RGB balance were excellent in this mode too. The key change with this mode though is that it clamps the colour space back to sRGB very well, and this results in excellent colour accuracy now for SDR and sRGB content. The DCI-P3 mode is configured differently though, targeting a 2.6 gamma, D63 white point and 48 nits luminance out of the box. Those are all per the DCI-P3 theatre standard. You can change the brightness and the gamma controls if you want to configure this mode differently, although you are stuck with the D63 white point instead of the more common D65. This mode meets these targets very well, although with a 2.6 gamma, keep in mind that you do get pretty major black crush and loss of shadow detail, which is to be expected. This mode also offers some decent clamping back to the DCI-P3 colour space, removing the 9% over coverage from the native mode, although going slightly too far in some shades and reducing absolute coverage from 99% to around 97%. No big deal anyway, and DCI-P3 colour accuracy was very good, with the only real error in pure red where the colour space can't quite cover that full reference. This mode is most useful if you're specifically working with content that's mastered in the DCI-P3 theatre standard. Since this is a WOLED panel, shadow detail of the screen depends on your active refresh rate, since these panels show some gamma shift as the refresh rate changes. In native wide gamut mode, shadow detail was moderate at the native 165Hz refresh rate, but did improve at 60Hz where the luminance of the near black shades was raised a little bit. The changes and improvement weren't quite as good in the sRGB mode, and you can see here again that according to our measurements, the gamma is configured to 2.2 instead of the sRGB gamma. There's also a dark stabilizer setting in the menu which adjusts the gamma, but each mode behaves quite differently in terms of which shades it brightens. Mode 1 and Mode 3 make very little difference to shadow detail near black, instead raising lighter parts of the image. Mode 2 does improve near black detail quite a bit, bringing out RGB3 now, while also raising the luminance of darker shades. That's probably the most appropriate if you want to consider using it for darker content and gaming. When it comes to HDR, the OLED panel offers all of the usual benefits of this technology, with per pixel level dimming for amazing image control, no halos, no blooming, and it can basically also offer an infinite contrast ratio with true 0 nits blacks. Actually, the new Tandem WOLED panel and the glossy screen coating offer some further benefits here, providing the deepest blacks and best contrast in brighter room conditions compared with other WOLED panel options, and certainly compared with QD-OLED as well. You can see how the Tandem WOLED technology retains its black depth much better, and even the latest QD-OLED panels can't keep up with this, and it's a key strength of this WOLED technology. Despite the removal of the white subpixel, Alienware haven't sacrificed too much in the way of the HDR brightness specs, with the screen still meeting the Display HDR True Black 500 tier and offering a peak brightness spec of 1300 nits. The smaller sized 27-inch and 32-inch RGB-stripe panels that have been released so far have taken more of a hit compared with the RGWB versions, dropping down to True Black 400 certification and 1000 nits peak. So it is nice to see that that wasn't necessary here on the Alienware model. The larger screen size should allow more robust cooling and heat dissipation, and so it seems that they've been a little bit more bullish with the brightness output as a result. There's support for both HDR10 and Dolby Vision HDR formats on the screen, and there's 7 different preset modes to choose from in the menu, plus the additional Dolby Vision mode if you use that as well. Most of the modes only offer a peak brightness up to around 555 nits, including the familiar True Black certified mode. There's also 2 peak brightness modes, Peak 1300 and Peak 1300 Bright, which both reach up to the maximum panel brightness, hitting just over that spec in our testing. We can compare the peak white luminance measurements here against the RGB version of the panel as well, where you can see that, of course, that offers some fairly substantial increases in many situations, including, for instance, for a 10% window, which increases from 555 nits to 752 nits in our testing. Remember though that this is a very specific measurement environment, and we do need to consider further metrics to compare them more thoroughly. If we add in the recent 34-inch ultrawide QD OLED Alienware model, that also has an RGB stripe layout but a competing QD OLED panel. You can see that the overall white luminance behaviour is quite similar to the larger 39-inch WOLED panel here, which is interesting. The RGB stripe structure on this WOLED panel seems to make it behave more like a QD OLED panel, although that could also be related to Alienware's consistent tuning across different new models in their range. Like I say, this is only a very specific measurement situation though, and real-world comparisons are more useful and relevant, which we'll look at in a moment. Before we do, let's just have a quick look at the EOTF tracking in each mode. And it's a fairly familiar pattern here to what we've seen from QD OLED monitors in the past. The True Black mode offers the most accurate tracking in all scenes, but has a capped maximum brightness of around 555 nits, so it lacks the punch in bright highlights in darker scenes. The Peak 1300 mode is accurate in dark scenes and can reach up to the higher 1300 nits peak brightness, giving more impressive highlights in those situations. But in brighter overall scenes, you get panel dimming, just like you do on QD OLED panels in fact, and the image is quite a lot darker than it should be. Alienware have also provided the Peak 1300 Bright mode to try and compensate for this, which offers more accurate EOTF now in the brighter scenes, but it requires over brightening in darker scenes. It doesn't raise the black point, but it does brighten the whole scene a little bit, and it's not as accurate now in terms of the artistic intent of the content, but it does improve overall brightness and shadow detail too. Personally, I think I prefer this balance for a brighter overall experience, and the regular Peak 1300 mode is just too dark. In real world content, you can see here that in all scenes, the True Black mode is overall brighter than the 2 peak modes. In fact, its luminance is twice as high as the standard Peak 1300 mode, and so it's brighter for everything apart from those peak highlights in very dark scenes. The boosted Peak 1300 Bright mode offers some improvements, but remains around 43% lower luminance on average than the True Black mode, which is a shame here. The over-brightening compensation isn't sufficient to fully solve the panel dimming in the brighter overall scenes, and so this mode is a little bit darker in many situations, although we do think this is often offset by the more impactful highlights, which do make a difference to the HDR experience. Adding in the LG 39-inch equivalent and Alienware's 34-inch ultra-wide QD OLED monitor released this year, and you can see that the 2 Alienware models are fairly close to one another in real scene brightness, with a slight edge going to the smaller 34-inch model, but the 39-inch LG model, with its additional white subpixel in the panel structure, reaches quite a bit brighter in many situations. That's not surprising really, given the removal of the white subpixel here, although it does tend to be in the very light and white parts of the image where there's a more noticeable difference in brightness side by side. In many situations actually, the screens look more similar than this might suggest. The shadow detail in dark content is actually better in the Peak 1300 Bright mode than the True Black mode, and again varies depending on the refresh rate due to the variable gamma of WOLED panels. It's very good in the Peak 1300 Bright mode anyway, with RGB2 visible even at 165Hz, but in the True Black mode it's RGB8 at the same refresh rate, so you get more black crush in that mode than the Peak 1300 Bright mode. This is largely because of that over brightening in the Peak 1300 Bright mode, which applies in dark content and dark tones. One fairly significant change is with the colour volume and colour brightness in HDR. We've talked about this at length in our recent review of ASUS's 32-inch RGB-stripe WOLED screen as well, so We'd encourage you to read that review for loads more information on this topic. The crux of this though is that in darker scenes where there are bright colour highlights, this RGB stripe panel can offer improved colour saturation and colour brightness. Think about things like red brake lights on a car at night, fireworks on a night sky, or neon lights in a dark city scene for instance. On the RGWB version of the panel, where the white subpixel is used, in these dark scenes the white boost comes into play more, sometimes increasing overall brightness but causing some noticeable washout of the colours. One way to look at this is through measurement of colour volume, which measures colours across the full range of luminance that the panel can offer in HDR. This is a more thorough way to measure colour in HDR than just looking at 2D chromaticity measurements. At the moment, there's no standard industry approach to measuring colour volume for HDR, with various competing approaches and lack of general consensus, but we think the most relevant and useful approach right now is using a measurement approach that's based around the CIE lab framework, where measurements are taken relative to the peak luminance of the panel. And then the results can be presented using a 2D diagram called gamut rings, which is simple to understand and compare. We'll provide gamut ring diagrams here compared to the BT 2020 colour space, and basically the more coloured in the rings are and the less grey areas there are, the higher the colour volume is. In dark scenes you can see that the RGB stripe panel offers a significantly larger colour volume than the RGWB panel for the reasons that we've just explained, with 81% higher colour volume in fact in this instance. There's also a fairly substantial difference even in brighter scenes we found with this RGB stripe panel. On the LG model, the colour space is clamped back a little bit in HDR mode compared with the native SDR mode, and so from a 2D chromaticity point of view, the two screens measure pretty much the same. But the additive approach of the RGB stripe panel and the removal of the white subpixel results in a somewhat more colourful image in HDR, even in brighter scenes we thought. And that is supported by these volume measurements quite nicely. This observation is also supported by XCR colour brightness measurements, which show around 7% brighter colours on the Alienware model in most scenes, pushing up to around 41% brighter in the darkest scenes. In practice, this is surprisingly noticeable, with colours looking brighter, more vivid and more impactful in darker scenes, which makes a difference to the overall experience. Despite the LG model looking brighter in some situations, the overall enjoyment of HDR is closer than we expected really, as a big part of the HDR experience are those bright highlights and those colourful highlights which just look better on the Alienware model. The colour volume of this Alienware screen is very similar to the 32-inch RGB stripe ASUS screen as well, and QD OLED panels that we've tested as well, which you can see here for comparison. Not surprising since they've all got an RGB structure and no white subpixel. Colour accuracy was also very good in HDR mode, with the same colour space active as in SDR mode and very low delta E values as well, which was great news. A quick note on Dolby Vision support as well. This mode is restricted to the same maximum brightness as the True Black mode in HDR10, reaching around 555 nits maximum. There doesn't appear to be any mode which pushes up to 1300 nits for Dolby Vision, and we believe the reason for this is because of the dynamic metadata, with the intention here being to offer an accurate EOTF performance, and so that does mean that you're limited to the lower max brightness in these modes. Grayscale, RGB balance and colours should remain consistent too though, compared with the other modes. You can switch to Dolby Vision mode via the menu when you might need it. Dolby Vision HDR content and support from a PC is very limited though, and complicated to get working right now, so you'd almost certainly be better off sticking with the HDR10 mode for PC connections. If you're connecting an external device like an Xbox Series X or perhaps a streaming media device of some sort, those can often support Dolby Vision content more readily, so you can switch to that mode in the menu when you want to use it. We've already talked about the excellent text rendering of the screen thanks to the pretty high 143 ppi pixel density, the RGB stripe panel and the glossy screen coating. It's well suited to office and productivity work, and split screen working is great on a screen this size. The 5K 2K resolution is a really great upgrade over earlier 39-inch ultrawide OLED screens on the market, offering 123% more pixels in fact. Much more desktop space to go with that as well, and a sharper and clearer image of course. It's also a noticeable upgrade compared with common 34-inch ultrawide models that have the same 3440 by 1440 resolution as those older 39-inch models. Some people may be okay with using the resolution at 100% OS scaling, giving you a really large desktop space to work with, but text and icons can be pretty small. Other people might want to use something like 125% scaling for more comfortable text size and still a decent desktop space to work with. At 125% scaling, the text size is very similar to a common 27-inch 1440p monitor, so that should give you an idea, although of course with a better pixel density and a sharper image here, and that's a good balance we felt overall. There's a great range of modern connectivity options, including full-speed DP 2.1 with UHBR20 speeds, 2 HDMI 2.1 ports, and USB Type-C with 90 watts power delivery. If you've got a DP 2.1 graphics card, which supports UHBR20 speeds, the screen will run without DSC in that configuration. If you've only got a lower tier DP 2.1 graphics card, like a UHBR 13.5 for instance, then it will need to use DSC to support the full spec. You can also use the screen at full spec from an older DP 1.4 graphics card as well, courtesy of DSC, so there's wide support here for older systems still. Just keep in mind, of course, the demands on your system for powering this kind of spec for any kind of gaming. There's also one USB-A data port on the back, and then a handy quick access port selection on the bottom edge of the screen, with another USB-A port with charging, USB Type-C data port with 15 watts power delivery, and a headphone jack too. Picture-in-picture and picture-by-picture modes are supported for handling multiple video inputs. There's a KVM switch function too, which could be useful for some people. Alienware have included a wider range of connectivity and extras on this model compared with their 34-inch QD model, making it more suitable for hybrid uses. The design is simple and looks overall smart. The stand provides tilt, height and swivel adjustments, which are all pretty easy to use, although height adjustment downwards was quite stiff on our sample. There's also a fair bit of wobble from the screen as you move it around or use the on-screen menu joystick. There's a small fan in the screen as per Alienware's previous OLED monitors, but this is super quiet and you really do have to press your ear right up to the top of the screen to be able to hear anything at all. The on-screen menu provides a very wide range of options and settings, although the OLED Care settings are very limited on this model. That's pretty surprising in today's market, but in keeping with their other OLED screens at least. There's nothing beyond just a pixel refresh function available in the menu to select. Navigation of the menu was quick and easy though. Note that there's no integrated speakers on the screen, although there's a headphone connection and eARC sound over HDMI, so you can connect to an external soundbar and speaker system potentially that way. Panel uniformity is a potential concern with the screen for professional apps and photography work, and there appears to be two aspects to this. Let me explain first of all how this works on LG's model for context. On the LG version of the screen, if you display a full white image on that screen and then measure the luminance across the panel, the uniformity of the screen was excellent on our sample. The same thing applies for full screen Excel spreadsheets or blocks of colour. You get nice consistent luminance. However, where there's more varied content on the screen, like a game, a video, or sometimes even your desktop wallpaper, then sometimes an OLED Care feature called CPC kicks in, which starts to dim the edges and corners of the screen a bit. This can lead to a slight vignetting effect. This is visible in certain situations, although to be honest this is hard to see in most dynamic content. By switching then to a full light grey background after playing a game on the LG model, we measured around a 30% drop in luminance across the edges of the panel in these situations, where that CPC feature activates. When you then return to more consistent content or something like a full screen white test again, the edges slowly start to brighten up again, and after around 30 seconds they're back to being consistent with the centre of the screen and you get that nice uniform panel brightness again. Small variations in viewing angles caused by the screen curvature are unavoidable, but hopefully these photos demonstrate the visual difference between the CPC feature and then the regular operation. There's no option on the LG model in the on-screen menu to disable this panel care feature, by the way. Anyway, that's the LG model. On the Alienware screen, the CPC feature was also present, but exacerbating this issue on our sample was poor luminance uniformity of the panel itself. Even when showing full white test images, the right and the left-hand edges of the screen were around 40% lower luminance than the center area. This uniformity could vary, of course, between different samples. That's just what we saw on our sample. In the same situations as the LG model, the CPC OLED care feature kicks in during gaming, dynamic content, and in some other situations, further dimming the edges and the corners of the screen, including now the top and the bottoms as well, dropping the luminance another 20% or so. This creates a more obvious vignetting effect in certain situations, although to be fair again, it's hard to spot this in most dynamic and variable content. The double whammy of the CPC feature and the poor panel uniformity that already existed on the right and left hand sides on our sample makes this more noticeable though. Like the LG model, when you return to the white test image or something like a full screen spreadsheet or something, the edges brighten up again, and after 30 seconds you're back to the somewhat improved panel uniformity as it was before. Certainly better, but again that might vary depending on the sample. Unfortunately, on the Alienware sample, the poor underlying panel uniformity, at least on our sample, could not be resolved any further. Again, Alienware don't provide an option to disable the CPC feature at this time. Seemingly separate to this, we also found that there seemed to be some desaturation of some colours on the edges of the Alienware screen. Most noticeable, for instance, using something like this orange shade on this example shown, where you can see this variation, especially on the right-hand edge of the screen, and this didn't seem to be a problem at all on the LG model. This didn't seem to be caused by the CPC feature, as these were tested after the screen had restored to its baseline luminance, but perhaps it could be linked to the panel uniformity overall. To be fair again, in most dynamic content we didn't find this a problem, as the image is changing so much and it's only visible really on certain shades as well, but we didn't find it overly distracting in desktop apps, as we tend not to use full screen windows or anything like that. But if you're working with photography apps or lots of blocks of colour or professional applications, you may find the edge dimming and the panel uniformity an issue perhaps. We fed this back to Alienware for consideration in case anything can be done to allow control over the CPC feature in the future. On the other hand, the panel is better than the previous Tandem WOLED panels when it comes to the uniformity of the darkest content, and it's almost entirely free from the grey banding issues that impact other Tandem WOLED panels. The RGB panel from LG's model offered pretty low levels of vertical banding on our sample anyway, but it was even cleaner and clearer here at the native 165Hz refresh rate. At 330Hz in dual mode, there was a little bit more of a dirty texture, but it was very slight on the Alienware model, and again, better than the LG version. We saw similar improvements to this on the 32-inch RGB-stripe OLED panel that we tested recently, so it looks like this is probably a universal improvement with the removal of the white subpixel, which is very welcome. The AW3926QW is well suited to gaming, especially for titles which support a 21:9 aspect ratio, where you can then enjoy the full widescreen experience. That goes along with the great immersion of a large display and the curved format of something like this. For more common 16:9 sources, including games consoles, once you set the correct aspect ratio option in the menu, the screen will scale the image and put black bars down the sides, and it can support 4K content natively with 1:1 pixel mapping. The OLED panel offers the usual near instant response times that you'd expect, and there's a native 165Hz refresh rate which offers good motion clarity. That's combined with the excellent detail and sharpness that you get from the high resolution panel. You can find much higher refresh rates from smaller OLED monitors of course, and those will offer further improvements in motion clarity, system latency and other gaming performance metrics. But powering 5K 2K at high refresh rates is always going to be a challenge anyway, and that's the limit right now from currently available panels of this spec. It's a shame that we don't have 240Hz refresh rates in this space yet, especially when supporting frame gen technology, which is going to be limited to around 80 FPS here, and 240Hz would have allowed 120 FPS instead. Anyway, that's where we are right now with these 39-inch screens. To support faster gaming situations where you might want to prioritize speed and frame rate over detail and resolution, this screen also supports a dual mode function. That allows you to increase your refresh rate up to 330Hz when dropping to a lower ultra-wide full HD resolution of 2560 by 1080. You can enter dual mode via the on-screen menu using the other mode section as it's called, and you can also set this to one of the shortcuts in the quick launch menu if you like for easier access. although note that it isn't a single button press activation like you'll find on many dual mode monitors. You should also recheck your refresh rate and VRR settings in your graphics card control panel, as we found that each mode, the native and the dual mode, were recognised like two different displays, so you may need to just make sure that you've enabled G-Sync, for instance, when you've switched over to dual mode. In dual mode, it's obviously quite a significant drop in resolution, and you wouldn't be using it for things like desktop applications anyway, but in dynamic content and gaming, it's probably fine for a lot of situations, especially if you're sat a little bit further away from the screen using a control pad for gaming. It's also potentially useful for lower end systems and graphics cards where driving 5K, 2K gaming may be difficult. You've got that as an option here anyway, which is good news, and it's a welcome feature. The motion clarity, fluidity, latency and gaming experience is noticeably improved here at these higher frame rates too. There's also a couple of esports modes available which simulate smaller 25-inch and 27-inch size screens and will operate at the lower resolutions that are shown here, some functioning in the dual mode configuration to give you access to that full 330Hz refresh rate as well. There's also a 32-inch emulation mode which operates with 1:1 pixel mapping with 4K 165Hz if needed. There was also a good range of gaming extras and features on offer here, which include the dual mode function, also VRR anti-flicker mode, which we'll test in a moment. Note that there's no blur reduction mode offered here though, although that would probably be impractical in the native mode, as you'd be limited to around 80Hz BFI only because of the comparatively low 165Hz native refresh rate. Maybe it would have been useful in dual mode, where it could have in theory operated at 165Hz and boosted your motion clarity then to 330Hz like levels without you needing to power the higher frame rates, but it's just not included here. Variable refresh rates are supported using adaptive sync with certification under the AMD FreeSync Premium Pro, NVIDIA G-Sync compatible and VESA adaptive sync screens. And there's a VRR range of 48 to 165Hz. WOLED panels show variable gamma during VRR situations, and this leads to some flicker in certain situations. In native mode, this was high in very dark scenes, but very hard to see elsewhere, so overall it was not too bad. The trick with WOLED screens is to try and keep frame rates as consistent as possible, regardless of what that frame rate actually is. And in practice, this screen should have low levels of flicker in most situations if you can do that. In dual mode, there's a wider VRR range at play, and therefore more room for the gamma to shift, and therefore more potential flicker if you get very large frame rate swings, but overall it behaves similarly to the native mode. Alienware provide an anti-flicker option in the menu as well, which behaves differently to similar features that we've seen from other manufacturers in the past. This doesn't make any change to the available VRR range in either the native or the dual mode configuration, and VRR seems to still remain active. The frame rate counter certainly shows that it's changing as the FPS changes, for instance. This does, however, seem to completely eliminate flicker altogether, even in our stress testing scenarios, but it does seem to cause some games to be a bit less smooth. We're not really sure what's being done here, but if you find flicker problematic, you can try this mode out and see how you get on. Console support was excellent, and you can use the aspect ratio controls in the menu to avoid image stretching and set a 16:9 aspect ratio. Using the auto mode is simplest, and then there's native support for 4K 120Hz content with 1:1 pixel mapping. There's VRR support, HDR10 and Dolby Vision HDR as well. The only gaps really are that there's no blur reduction mode, which could have been useful for 120Hz, and there's no speakers built into this model. But there is eARC sound to pass the sound to a compatible soundbar or speaker system, as well as a headphone connection in an easy access location on the bottom edge of the screen. Input lag is very low in the standard 165Hz and 330Hz mode, and remains low for 120Hz inputs too, but increases a modest amount for 60Hz devices, but nothing crazy. Remember, it's the lower 165Hz or 330Hz number that applies during VRR gaming as well. The AW3926QW is an excellent screen, offering a really nice combination of size, resolution and great performance in the OLED space. We continue to really enjoy the larger 39-inch size, the comfortable 1500R curvature and the high 5K 2K resolution. It's really very enjoyable to use in a whole range of situations, and a dream ultra-wide combination for many people. In summarising the performance, we should compare it directly to the LG 39GX950B, the only other 39-inch ultrawide OLED monitor so far with this spec, as that helps with its market positioning quite nicely. The two key panel differences are the glossy screen coating and the RGB-stripe panel structure that we've talked about in detail during the review. The key difference being a clearer and sharper image on the Alienware, especially for text work, probably more suited to dimly lit rooms with a consideration for reflectivity. The matte coating of the LG makes it more suited to well-lit rooms on the other hand, and for those concerned about reflections. The removal of the white subpixel helps improve text clarity a little bit, reduces the Tandem WOLED grey banding, and enhances colour volume in HDR, but it comes at the expense of brightness in some situations. In SDR, that's unlikely to matter, we think, but in HDR, the LG screen is brighter in some situations, although on the other hand, the Alienware does have the edge in colours and very dark scenes, which is also important. Features vary between the two. You'll have to decide if things like the hardware calibration and integrated speakers on the LG are perhaps more useful to you than things like the KVM switch, Dolby Vision support, and a couple of convenient connections on the Alienware model, for instance. Perhaps the key consideration though is going to be the price, and there's a massive difference in the MSRP for these two models at the moment, with the Alienware model coming in at a huge $700 cheaper than the LG model. That's very hard to ignore and makes this screen a strong recommendation if you're looking for a larger ultra-wide screen right now. We expect LG will probably respond with some offers and discounts once the Alienware screen is more readily available and widely launched. And of course it's Black Friday coming up in the near future too. But the Alienware AW3926QW feels like a steal at this kind of price point right now. The screen should be available imminently in North America and Europe, and we'll update our affiliate link below when it's available so that you can check out the latest pricing and information for your region. We expect this one to be super popular given the impressive spec and performance and the very competitive price point. Do let us know in the comment section below if you're thinking of grabbing this yourself, or if you're looking at a different screen from Dell or the Alienware range, or something else entirely. Anyway, thank you for watching. We'll catch you next time.